My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Dr. Annette Becker. Dr. Becker serves as the director and curator of the Texas Fashion Collection, which is housed at the University of North Texas College of Visual Arts and Design, located in Denton, Texas. Recently, Dr. Becker was the curator and guiding force behind the current outstanding exhibition entitled Labor of Luxury: Embroidery from India to the World, on display at the Boston University Art Galleries until March 6th. This exhibition highlights the extraordinary artistry of Indian artisans whose hand embroidery and beadwork bring some of the world's most iconic fashion designs to life. Featuring more than 20 exquisite garments by Indian and Euro-American designers, the exhibition highlights both creative brilliance and the labor that makes luxury possible. During the program, Dr. Becker will inform us why and how the exhibition came about. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate the craftsmanship, cultural knowledge, and global supply chains embedded in these garments, and invite us to think more critically about how beauty, labor, and value intersect in what we wear. Let's start by meeting Dr. Becker and then finding out all about labor of luxury, embroidery from India to the world. Welcome, Annette. So delighted you're able to be here.
Thank you for having me, Jay.
Eager to hear all about the exhibition and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if you'd briefly share a little bit more about your background, perhaps academic, professional interest, and what your current position entails.
Yes, of course, I'd love to share a little bit about this project and my work at the Texas Fashion Collection. My role as director there involves curating and stewarding a collection of nearly 20,000 historic and designer garments and
Wow.
accessories. Our holdings include everything from a Roman sandal dated to between the years 3 and 400 that was dug up from an archaeological dig in the Thames River in London, all the way
Wow.
through contemporary fashion pieces just from the past few years. And our holdings include everything from pieces by the most famous designers in the world, like Coco Chanel and Christian Dior, to materials that in our database are have grandma listed as their designer. So we're
Wow.
really lucky to have an incredible cache of materials that we get to
Yeah.
share with people through academic programming on our campus, through lectures around the country, and then luckily through exhibitions like this.
Fabulous, fabulous. Speaking of the exhibition, what first inspired labor of luxury, and why was embroidery the right focus for this exhibition?
I think when people imagine what a fashion exhibition might look like, they might think of really beautiful, elevated clothing, not necessarily your gym clothes and pajamas, but something that feels extraordinary compared to what we wear on a daily basis. And in presenting things like evening wear and cocktail clothing, we can really lean into people's expectations for these
Mhm.
projects, but we also really want them to think more deeply about the materials that they're in awe of when they go into galleries. And by focusing on the handwork that's entailed in these pieces being produced, we can really help people think more deeply, not just about the overall awe they feel, but really think practically about how these pieces were created and whose hands were actually involved in that labor.
And why is embroidery such a powerful lens for talking about labor, skill, and cultural knowledge?
I think hand embroidery is something that many people just feel in awe of because we get to experience it so infrequently in our
Mhm.
lives. We tend to think of a lot of the clothing we wear being produced in industrial systems where we think of machines having a really large role in those pieces being produced. When actually, in reality, people's hands are manipulating those machines, and even something like machine embroidery really has a hand element to it. But with pieces that really have directly hand embroidered materials, I think that really pulls us us out of our everyday experiences with clothing and allows us to focus in a deeper way. I think histories of handwork also go much deeper. We can go further back into history to understand the history of hand-produced materials. So that broader historical scope, I think, allows us to pull ourselves even more out of our everyday experiences with dress.
You know, I've read that you described this as a lesser told story. Why have the artisans behind hand embroidery so often been left out of fashion narratives?
That's such a great question. Often, when we think about high fashion, we think about the names of designers who are stitched into our luxury
Mhm.
garments if we're lucky enough to have those in our own wardrobes. And the fashion system really encourages us to privilege those designers as the people who represent entire manufacturing systems, production systems that are often behind the scenes. So,
Mm.
especially at our university, we're often encouraging people to think through whose names are being presented to them and whose names are being left out of those narratives. So this exhibition is really an opportunity to celebrate some of those well-known names like Oscar de la Renta or Vera Wang, but to also remind people that they aren't the only people whose hands have touched these pieces or whose artistic talent and skill has produced them. So instead, we're encouraging people to think more broadly about fashion production. And while a lot of the well-known designers that we might be able to name are working in fashion capitals like New York and Paris and London, a lot of the handwork that's being done to make things for those fashion capital brands is being done throughout the entire world.
Mm.
Fashion brands really like creating a sense of maybe mystery or a sense of romance around the production of
Mm.
things, say, made in the ateliers or workshops of Paris. But in reality, few pieces by even luxury Parisian brands are being handcrafted in Paris or even in France. Many of those materials are being produced in India, but those brands really like us to maintain the mystery around, say, Paris. So it's really exciting to introduce these embroiderers to people and remind folks that India plays a very important role in fashion production today.
Could you build a little bit more on that and talk about India's central role in contemporary global fashion production, particularly hand beading and embroidery, please?
Absolutely. So, generally speaking, if there's something in someone's wardrobe that includes beads or sequins that have been hand stitched to the surface of a textile, um, with almost 100% certainty, that work has been done in India.
Wow.
Sometimes that can even be obscured by, say, made in name of country label on your garment. So, for example, in this exhibition, there are many pieces that have labels that say made in the USA. And while that's not untrue, often the last step of putting all of the components of the garment together is done in the US. Often those component pieces are made in other parts of the world. However, the way that labeling practices are done, it just doesn't show the diversity of places and cultures that inform that. And really, India's history with beading and handwork goes back centuries as we think through workshops that have made materials for, say, Mughal emperors, as we think through even through British colonization. A lot of these embroidery workshops continuing to exist even as the Indian textile trade was decimated. So
Mm.
when India gained independence in the 1940s and was figuring out ways of culturally and economically establishing itself on a global stage, these embroidery workshops were a really important resource for them. And the Indian government even put together initiatives that connected Euro-American fashion designers with these artisans in India so that these designers' visions could be executed in the workshops of India. And it's really the story told in this exhibition is really starting from those moments of Indian artisans working anonymously to moving to the point where they're being recognized more, to now
Mm.
there are even Indian designers who are working with workshops in their own countries to celebrate that artisanal history and also the artistic leadership that happens in India.
Oh, very exciting, very exciting. You know, given the wide range of possibilities, how did you approach selecting designers and garments for this exhibition?
You know, it really is a challenge with a collection of nearly 20,000 artifacts. It's a delightful challenge and one I'm happy to have. So I'd love to share some of the examples from our collection
Please
and from this
do.
exhibition with
Please
you.
do.
So we start on this page with the title of the exhibition and then three pieces that are in the project. So you can just sort of get a sense of how colorful
Mm,
and detailed these wonderful designs are. And next, I'll share a few gallery views of the exhibition. Here we have the intro text featuring labor of luxury embroidery from India to the world. And you can see what's honestly my personal favorite piece in the exhibition,
mm,
a jumpsuit made by the designer Ashish. This was one of the pieces that jump started me thinking about this exhibition because Ashish is a designer who was born in India, shows in London Fashion Week, but all of his the handwork done for his pieces is created in India in a workshop that's run by his mom. And he often works alongside the artisans who are creating these pieces to have a good understanding of how to manipulate the sequins that make all of his pieces really special. So this specific garment, well, it looks like it's made out of crocheted granny squares, a kind of material that many of us are probably familiar with. It is actually made out of thousands of sequins hand stitched to the
oh,
surface of this garment to give the impression of that nubbly wool texture. And really make us think, why is it that we don't really value and honor granny squares as much as we could? Sometimes it takes a designer recontextualizing something familiar in the space of high fashion for us to really appreciate the everyday even more.
mm,
Um, and Ashisha's work plays a really important role in the exhibition, and that we have several pieces by him featured here. So, in this gallery view, which was taken while we were installing the project, which is why the intro text is missing in the front, you can see the granny square piece in the background, and then in the foreground, you can see a garment that looks like a tunic that on the
mhm,
top has clouds, on the middle register has what looks like hand scrawled flowers, and then a pair of pants that look like they're made out of really simple cotton gingham. This is another example of work by Ashish, who in this piece was remembering his childhood growing up in India and remembering monsoon season. So that it looks like a child scrawled these clouds is exactly what Ashish meant to represent, not just clouds in the most photorealistic way they could be depicted, but instead presenting them as a child might remembering something from the past. So this is a really lovely piece that shows, I think, the real talent and skill of these Indian artisans. And you can see through the rest of the gallery that this sequined piece is complemented by a lot of other materials that have really beautiful hand beading and work. If you wanted to just pop into the gallery for a minute, this vignette or this tableau with these four pieces is a really great sampler for the
mm,
entire exhibition. So we move from the 1960s on the left with a vest made by Carol Horn, a New York-based designer who is one of the first Euro-American designers to be brought to India by the Indian government to meet with artisans there. That cultural interaction really transformed the aesthetic of her work, which you can see here has these sort of the scrawling soutache or sort of cord that's
mm.
been stitched to the surface, and these dynamic elephants that are covered with spangles, which is a
Wow.
historic form of sequins. So we move from that example of Carol Horn working with artisans anonymously to then the piece next to it is by Todd Oldham, a Texan designer who showed in New York Fashion Week in the 90s, who relied heavily on the work of artisans in Mystic Beading, a company that he acknowledged in, say, press releases and interviews for doing the handwork that brought his sketched visions to life through sequins and beads hand stitched to the surface of this garment. So we've moved from designers using Indian workshops to really framing them as necessary collaborators for their
Mm,
work. Then, as we move even further closer to our own time period, we have a bomber style jacket created by the Belgian designer Dries van Noten, who in a recent documentary described the ways that when he started his career in the 1980s, he really saw India as a place to go merely for production, but then realized season to season that artisans were not always available to work with him because they didn't have consistent work and their
mm.
labor wasn't being valued enough for them to stay in the world of fashion. So some really brilliant artisans and creatives were leaving the fashion industry because they weren't being supported properly. So since then, Dries Van Noten has made a point of creating collections that every collection collaborates with the same artisans to make sure season after season they're giving proper work and support for their
Mhm.
labor. And he's been able to imagine new possibilities for his creative work because he sees these artisans as integral to his creative process. And then
Nice.
finally, on the end, you can see an example again by Ashish, who is one of our favorites. While this looks like it might be a letter jacket or a varsity jacket
Yeah.
from a sports team, this instead is a blouse entirely covered in sequins.
Wow.
So again, Ashish is an example of an Indian designer working with Indian artisans, really making sure that India is on the forefront of conversations when it comes to fashion with these beautifully handcrafted pieces.
Fabulous, fabulous. The images are terrific, but I know don't do justice until seeing these creations in person. Really a must to visit the exhibition before March 6th.
It's so true. I think that is one of the special things about visiting museums and galleries is that, in our day-to-day lives, we interact with screens so much, and there is so much value that we can have in interacting with content, maybe even like this. But experiencing things in the physical world around us, appreciating the texture and the way light is reflected off these materials, I think it reminds us to really be in the moment and be present in the spaces we're in. And I really hope this exhibition encourages people to do that too.
And so helpful to hear your background information and insight into the designer pieces. Just lets us appreciate them that much more.
Yeah, there are so many really incredible materials and makers that are represented in this project. Two of the people we really wanted to make sure to highlight in here are Todd Oldham. So I mentioned him briefly with the gold jacket we just saw, but there are a few other pieces by him in the project. You can see on the left side of the screen here an ensemble that looks like it has Harlequin diamonds on the pants,
Mm.
and then a light pink ensemble. Both of these were handcrafted by artisans in mystic beading. In these photographs, the pants, for example, look like they're just, patterned fabric, like we might be able to see in anything in our own
Mm.
wardrobe. But what's incredible is every single one of those diamonds has a different kind of material hand stitched to the surface to make those
Wow.
motifs. So, say the celery green diamond is entirely sequin stacked like shingles to make sure they're really dense with a saturated color.
Ah,
It's lovely to see these in photographs, but really being able to appreciate that materiality in person is important. And then to really respect that there are artisans in India hand stitching each of these sequins down.
unbelievable.
It's not just a field of color, it's actual material, and respecting that is important.
What assumptions about Indian fashion or craftsmanship do you hope this exhibition disrupts?
What a great question. I think with a lot of the way the news and media really represent India, it's as a place that manufacturers say fast fashion. We often hear of sweatshops and places in that part of the world that don't have very responsible labor practices, or maybe are producing things with such tight margins that we tend to think of India as a place that doesn't always produce the highest quality things that can be celebrated on a
Mm.
global stage. And while there are certainly manufacturing sites like that in India and in other places around the world, it is really important to remember Indian artisans are capable of many different types of work, including the kinds of things that we celebrate on a day-to-day basis anyway. So remembering that India is a site of really elevated production and cultural production is really important. I think it's
Right.
also important to recognize that artisans in India are not only producing things that relate to Indian cultural heritage, but relate to broader global conversations about design and aesthetics. So, for example, on the right side of the screen, you can see three garments that were all created with work from Naeem Khan, an Indian-born New York-based designer who's still showing in New York Fashion Week today. If you were to look at these three pieces, it might be surprising to know that they were made under some of the same creative leadership.
Mm.
But it's really important to think about ways that artisans and designers' careers develop. So, for example, the blue dress was made when Naeem Khan worked with Halston, the really famed American designer who is good friends with, say, Andy Warhol and Liza Minnelli. And Naeem Khan worked behind the scenes with Halston to develop really beautiful textiles that related to that Studio 54 disco aesthetic, not necessarily his upbringing in India. The middle piece is then from a brand that he started in Los Angeles called Riazi, which in the 1980s made these incredible disco ball jewel box kinds of garments. This one you can see it looks like it has a sash across the front that says pittura, which is Italian for painting. I think really staking a claim that Naeem Khan and the craftsmen that he worked with could paint in sequins, and that this work is really almost a kind of artwork. And then
Mm.
lastly, the red dress on the end is from Naeem Khan's label under his own name. And when you're able to see this in person, you'll notice that there are these beautiful paisley shapes, which are called botes, which rather than originally coming from Paisley, Scotland, where we get that name,
Mm.
originated in India and sort of in that region. So this is a really lovely example of Naeem Khan drawing on his own cultural heritage and translating it for a global high fashion audience. That the same sets of artisans working in his family's workshop created the beading and embroidery for all three of these pieces really shows the diversity and broad variety of skill that these artisans in India have. India is not a single faceted place, but a
Mm.
multifaceted one. And I love that in this exhibition we can share some of those facets.
Most definitely, most definitely. What's it been like to bring this exhibition into the academic gallery setting at Boston University?
We've really loved working with Boston University, and we really appreciate academic spaces for the ways that they really push people to think a little bit harder and deeper. So, of course, that happens in other museum and gallery spaces too. But, say, in our university context, we really value research, and to be able to have an audience at BU that feels the same way is really important to us. So, that's been really exciting. I've also been really pleased to be able to share some of these pieces with a new audience and maybe expose them to some designers they're less familiar with. So in this exhibition, there are even a few stories that are more specific to, say, our context in Texas and near
Mm.
Dallas. So for example, this is a small vignette that shows two pieces with beading and embroidery leadership from the company ANK International, run by Sachin and Bobby Aluwalia, which are a couple who met when they were going to fashion school in New York and then started a company making really beautiful beading and embroidery for a lot of New York-based brands, and then actually even opened their own brand under their own name.
Mm.
So the dress you can see on the right here was created under the Carolina Herrera brand, but this has some interesting Texan history, and that this piece was commissioned by the Dallas-based department store Neiman Marcus to celebrate their 100th
Ah,
anniversary.
wow.
And because our collection was originally started by Neiman Marcus, we have a lot of regional cultural specificity here too. So to get to share stories about Texas and North Texas and Dallas as a fashion leader for the country, it's really exciting sharing those stories in Boston and with another audience. We can often think of New York as being the fashion capital of the US, but Boston historically has been a very
Mm.
fashionable city. There are different aesthetics and ways that the fashion industry and audiences have been developed across the country. So getting to share these stories about global high fashion and Indian artisans, but also with a little bit of Texas history is pretty fun.
Fabulous for sure. What's been some of the reaction and feedback you've received or heard from people in the gallery?
So it's been really lovely to be able to share pieces that people are excited to experience in person. This is now the third time that we've been able to install this exhibition, and every single time people say they're just blown away that moving from photographs to seeing the materials in front of them, it just really transforms their understanding of fashion and the work that goes into these pieces. So, like I mentioned before, this jumpsuit created by Ashish is one that really catches people a little
Oh,
off guard. And really, until you see this in person up close, it's almost impossible
yeah.
to understand this is made out of sequins. And that really is some of the best feedback we've gotten, that actually going to the exhibition is transforming people's understanding of these
Mhm.
materials. So I so appreciate the work that you do, encouraging people to patronize these spaces because our physical access to these materials is so important.
Wonderful. What do you hope visitors are still thinking about after they've seen the exhibition?
I really hope after people see the exhibition that they move out into other spaces in the world and start noticing clothing more. Every day we get dressed, or at least I hope we do. And we're wearing clothing that people have designed and produced for us. And I think the best thing that fashion exhibitions can do is help people not only appreciate things in the galleries, which are moments for us to use our eyes and our critical thinking skills in a different, elevated way, but then bring some of that attention and care into the things that are in our everyday lives. I think fashion is a particularly powerful force for that because not all of us get to be around, say, fine art, beautiful ceramics, paintings on a day-to-day basis, but we are all clothing ourselves. So to really have something that's so familiar in our lives that we can think about in that elevated way, there's something really powerful in that. And I really think it helps bring us together as people when we recognize the many people who make something as simple as a shirt come into our lives.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Thinking back, what surprised you perhaps the most while researching or curating the exhibition?
One of the things that surprised me most is how few pieces in our collection were by known Indian makers.
Ah,
So India really is this production powerhouse when it comes to fashion. But in doing, say, searches in our database, there were very few pieces that were tagged as having a relationship with India. And
hmm.
again, a lot of that is because the fashion industry likes us to romanticize places like New York and Paris and London. And often labeling practices point us to some of those places even more. So it's been really important for me to be critical of the materials in our collection and how we document them, to really think more expansively about who gets to claim some ownership of these pieces.
Hmm.
One of the best parts of working on this exhibition was making sure to add pieces to our collection that are by really accomplished Indian designers that just somehow are not necessarily receiving proper respect from collecting institutions like ours. So, for example, this incredibly ornate dress that has hand embroidery, machine embroidery, applique that's in 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions. It has sequins that have been hand stacked and stitched to the
Oh,
surface, metalwork embroidery, and then
yeah.
these origami figures that are coming off the shoulders. Like the artisanship in this is incredible. So not only can we appreciate the materiality and the skill that went into making this, but it was produced by the designer Manish Arora, who was the first Indian designer to show in Paris Fashion Week. Before this project, we had not a single piece in our collection by Manish
Huh.
Arora. And some people might say, oh, it's a token effort adding an Indian designer to your holdings. But if Paris Fashion Week has allowed this incredible person to participate in that really elevated social and cultural space, clearly they have received stamps of approval far more important than being included in the Texas Fashion Collection. So this has been a really nice moment to be reflective on our practices and think about ways that we can do better because in the present and future, we need to be able to tell as many stories as possible. And if we're accidentally, systematically leaving out entire sets of stories like Manish Aurora's, we're not being responsible to the researchers and to the public that we serve.
Well said, well said. And that, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program. How can viewers and others find out more about the exhibition or possibly the Texas Fashion Collection?
Well, I would love for you all to come to the Boston University Art Galleries and see this in person. Our hosting director there has been really lovely. Alyssa Kramer has been great to work with. And I know the students who also help do some of the lighting and the platform building would love to see some of the viewers there and get, in-person feedback about what they find really compelling. You're also welcome to visit the Texas Fashion Collection's website, where we have information about upcoming exhibitions and also a link to our database where anyone with an internet connection has access to records for over 10,000 of our artifacts,
Wow.
represented by over 70,000 images. So if you're looking for a way to spend an entire evening, you can pull up a nice hot cup of tea, settle in your bathrobe, and click through tens of thousands of images of really incredible pieces that represent our shared fashion history.
You can pretend that bathrobe is made with all these sequins by some of the artisans that we've enjoyed. Well, this has really been a treat, Annette. Thank you so much for taking the time. We'll put some of that contact information in the closing credits and just want to wish you continued success with future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.